I want to welcome everyone this evening. I'm Ron Broidigam, and I'm currently the Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education. And I see a lot of people here that I'm happy can join us tonight. As one of my duties as Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education is to work with Nancy Anderson on residential colleges, and this has been a fun experience for me. This is my first year doing this job. I was Associate Dean for Undergraduate Studies in Weinberg for a couple of years before this. And then I've been on the faculty here for far too many years for me to really tell you about. But I am a faculty member in the economics department. I've probably had a number of you in my economics, intermediate microeconomics class. This dinner provides us with an interesting opportunity to come together and share ideas. And you could actually think of it as a very small example of what the overall mission of the residential college system is. And that is to help extend the learning experience of the university outside the classroom. And that's basically why residential colleges are so attractive to people. I mean, it happens through firesides, it happens through the research awards, it happens through seminars that we offer and field trips and all kinds of other ways. But it's wonderful when we have a chance to get together to hear someone like Gene Sunshine speak to us, share his perspectives on the way the world rotates, or as he may talk about tonight a bit about how the world did rotate at one time. But before I introduce Gene, I want to thank Nancy Anderson, who is seated here. Nancy, why don't you stand up so everybody can... Nancy does a wonderful job, as you know, working with all the residential colleges, and has done so for quite a few years, and I think she does a terrific job. And so I'm happy to have her around as a colleague. All right, so let me move on to the introduction, and that is, this is fun for me because I get to introduce one of my playmates in the central administration, and that's Gene Sunshine. Gene is now, I didn't realize this, but in his 10th year as the Senior Vice President for Business and Finance at Northwestern. And one of the nice things is having a chance to look at the bio, I realized that he really is an impressive person. He's had wonderful experiences. But let me just say something about what the Senior Vice President is. You may at some point want to ask questions about how business decisions are made in the university. But he is the Chief Business, Financial, Administrative, and Personnel Officer of the university, and that's an awfully big order. Basically, he holds the purse strings. He is a principal advisor to the President on non-academic matters. He's responsible for the development of policies and operating systems essential to fulfilling the academic and research missions of the university. That's really quite a big order. And before he came to Northwestern, he had a distinguished background as well. He was the Senior Vice President for Administration of the Johns Hopkins University. He came to Hopkins in March of 1987 as the treasurer of the university and was appointed to Senior Vice President in 1988. Before that, he served in several important capacities with the state of New York. He was Deputy Commissioner of Tax Policy Analysis in New York State Treasurer from 1982 till 1986. He was the Director of Energy Conservation for the New York State Energy Office from 1977 till 82. And he administered a multi-million-dollar energy conservation grant program, which benefited many colleges and universities in New York. In 1982, he received the Alfred E. Smith Award for Distinguished Service for his outstanding achievement in implementing the New York State energy conservation programs. Preceding his work with the State Energy Office, Gene was the Senior Budget Examiner in the New York State Division of the Budget. He's also served as Project Assistant at the New York State Urban Development Commission, so a lot of interesting public service. Gene and his wife, Holly, we can both claim as our own because they both received bachelor's degrees from Northwestern in 1971. Their son, Brad, also received a bachelor from Northwestern in June of 2001. Their daughter, Emily, received a bachelor from Emory, but she's doing a master's degree here. When she was at Emory, she was an All-American softball player, and I've seen some wonderful pictures in his office to verify that she was a very active player there. In addition to his degree from Northwestern, he received a Master of Public Administration from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs of Syracuse University in 1972. And currently he is active with certain business organizations, currently serves on the boards of directors of the Chicago Board Options Exchange, the Mentor Network in Boston, and the Nuveen Funds. He's a member of the audit committee of all three of these organizations, and he serves on the executive committee and as chairman of the compensation committee of the Chicago Board Options Exchange. So he's fair game. You can ask him lots of different types of questions about the university and about business and other things, and please help me offer a warm welcome to Gene Sunshine.
Ron, thank you. One additional piece of information. My wife, she mentioned my wife Holly, who graduated in '71, but her parents met here and graduated in '41, which is really pretty cool. So there's 41, 71, and then my son in 2001. So the pressure is on my two children to act in the right manner with respect to having children and where their children go to school. Thank you, Nancy, for inviting me to this. I've been looking forward to it, and I hope we can have some serious conversation tonight and maybe a little bit of fun also. If we can do both, we'll be doing very well. Ron talked about some of the areas that I'm responsible for. A lot of them are administrative managerial posts, the budget operation, the university's controller, the internal auditor, the facilities operation of the university, human resources, and university police. And in my job of being responsible for the police, I'm regularly involved in matters aimed at protecting the security and safety of you all, other faculty and students, and the staff. And I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about that later in connection with what happened in the way of safety and security and so forth when I was a student here and some of the other things that I'm responsible for. But in addition to these areas, which in themselves pose a lot of challenges, I think among the things that I really enjoy doing even more than having responsibility for those areas are what you might call more strategic or overarching kinds of responsibilities, items or actions having much longer term implications. And in those categories, I would place the university and the medical schools, for example, relationship with its hospitals that it deals with. Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Evanston Hospital, Children's Hospital, which some of you have read about or know, is moving from its location in Lincoln Park to Streeterville, which is where Northwestern Memorial Hospital and the Feinberg School of Medicine are located. In addition, I am at the point, so to speak, and have the arrows and bruises to show for it in the university's relations with the city of Evanston, in what we call town gown relations, which is a phrase, by the way, that was not coined in Evanston. There really are town gown relations and town gown issues all over the country. I wouldn't exactly say they're the same at Northwestern. Some are worse, some are better, but it's not one that was started here. And then also real estate. And that has to do with building on our real estate, but also making decisions about real estate that we may want to purchase, which is one of the reasons why I'm in love so much in the city of Evanston, but also in the city of Chicago, and not just purchasing real estate, but selling real estate. And we're in the process of doing that, in fact, with one of our pieces of land in the city of Chicago. These have these kinds of things, relationships with the hospitals, financial relationships, clinical type relationships, land relationships, and so forth, as well as the town gown relationships, have very long-term and very important ramifications for the university for its future. And as I was saying before, I think the fact that I went to school here and at one level have a very deep emotion for the place makes me want to do well in these other areas and pay a lot of attention to them, because the legacy of what I feel about Northwestern, I want to make sure is maintained for you all, for children of you all who may come to Northwestern, and for future generations. And so, while sometimes the impacts of what you do are not felt in today's budget or today's plans, they have long-term ramifications, and it's a fiduciary responsibility that I take very, very seriously. Now, moving away for a while from my current responsibilities, let me share with you, and hopefully we can have a little fun doing this, some of the differences in student life now, versus what it was like for me and others in the late 60s and early 70s. Again, I was here from 67 to 71. I don't know how many of you have ever even heard of the expression parietal hours. Does anybody know what that is? Faculty, I don't want to hear from you. Does anybody know what parietal hours? One. Okay, well, bridal hours were basically hours that they were restricted hours where if you were a guy, you could visit a girl in the girls' dorm, or vice versa. In those days, there were no hours. When I started here as a freshman, there were no hours. Women were not allowed in men's dorms, period, including, well, there weren't residential colleges, but including the Greek system. And the opposite was true as well. And during the time that I was here, that changed very dramatically, so that by the time I left, it was basically fair game, and you could largely go wherever you wanted to. But freshman year, when all the guys lived on the north end of the campus and all the girls lived on the south end of the campus, that's the way it was then, almost without exclusion, women had to be back in their dorms on the weekends at 2 o'clock in the morning, Friday and Saturday night. It was earlier during the week. So one of the interesting things was that if you were a guy dating somebody who lived in Allison Hall and you waited to the last minute, as most people did, to get their dates back at 2 o'clock in the morning, you were in the lobby of Allison Hall, crunched in there, you know, really elbow to elbow, because they were in the lobby there when everybody was bringing their dates back. And one thing that was always really fun was to be able to see who you went out with the week before and the week before that, and who they were with. And if you weren't careful and you wanted to, you know, heaven forbid, kiss your date goodnight, you had to be careful you didn't kiss the wrong date because you were so tight in there together. One of my colleagues recently referred to that period of time as a period of group grope, if you allow me to say that. But it really, in some respects, if you think about it as a sociological experience, and for many people, really their first or among their first introductions to getting to know and to date a little bit, it was incredibly awkward. You go forward 3 or 4 years till my senior year, and there was none of that because it was, you know, everybody for themselves in terms of when you were in the other person's dorms and all that sort of thing. Now, I mentioned the fact that the men were on the north end and the women were on the south end, and that led to something that has long gone by, and those were panty raids. Panty raids, again, this didn't start at Northwestern either, I don't think, but I'm not sure. But panty raids was a wonderful release from studying. They seemed to occur mostly when the weather was decent, because you sure as heck weren't going to go from the north end to the south end of the campus when it was 5 below zero, no matter what the reward was going to be at the other end. And so you as a study break, particularly in, you know, as the weather got nice, maybe during spring, you know, well, there was no study week back then, but when you were studying during the spring, you had a wonderful opportunity to get a break from it. And some group of guys would sort of start this, you know, let's go south kind of yelling and screaming, and you go down Sheridan Road, and it picked up steam. That is, it picked up other guys as you headed down. And you went into the dorm areas, in particular in the sorority quad areas. Remember, all the women were on the south end of campus, and you pleaded, and very oftentimes were rewarded with garments being thrown out, various types of garments being, and I'm not going to be more specific than that, but various types of garments. I don't want to embarrass you, Ron, so I'm being careful here. Being thrown out the windows, and that was something that was a big deal. And you all look at me like, what the heck is he talking about? But that was true. I get a huge chuckle now as an administrator talking about the Frostbite Express. When it gets below a certain degrees, the bus runs. Now, this is going to sound like somebody who studied by candlelight, like Abe Lincoln, and honest to goodness, we did have electricity back then, so that wasn't quite the case. But we had no Frostbite Express. You froze your butt off walking from the north end to the south end, or the south end to the north end. Mini skirts were really big back then. Women insisted, many of them insisted upon wearing mini skirts, and they froze in their mini skirts walking from the south. That was their decision. Walking from the south end of campus to the north end of campus. A lot of 8 o'clock classes. We were talking at our table that there's one class. What school? 7:45 in the morning, engineering? Yeah, one class. How many of you have ever had an 8 o'clock class? Ooh, more than I thought. Okay. Well, I had a lot of them. And they always seemed to be at 8 o'clock in the morning in the spring, much of which is cold. And in the winter quarter, when you had to schlep from the north end to campus for an 8 o'clock class. I made most of them. I was saying at my table, I had some friends who hardly made any of them. They just didn't want to get out of bed to walk down the campus. So there was no Frostbite Express, and there was a multitude of 8 a.m. classes, particularly seemingly winter quarter. We had things called date nights, you know, where you actually asked somebody to join you at your fraternity, or if there were residential colleges and there weren't, it might have well have been at a residential college, and you wore a tie and jacket, and you ate at the fraternity house or in the dorm or in the sorority house with white tablecloths with candles. And if you were fortunate and had somebody who lived in your dorm or your fraternity who actually was an entertainer type in the theater program, they would entertain the group after dinner. It really was, it was a lot of fun. Ties and jackets were required back then for guys to wear to dinner, even on events other than date night. And for a number of those years, women had to wear skirts to dinner. And that went away also during the 4 years, but it was like that early on. We stood in for hours in Patton Gym, trying to register for classes. With the perspiration, you know, and getting up, waiting on long lines, getting up to the front, only to find out that your class that you needed or wanted was closed, and having to get on another. I mean, it was really dreaded. So when you run into frustrations registering online, you know, think of folks like me, you know, who went through unbelievable. It was in Patton Gym, it was in Parks Hall. It was a really angry day for a lot of people. It took a long time, and as I say, you had your coats on and no place to put your coats, and you're warm and so forth. And then the thing that my wife loves, or should say really hates the most, which I didn't even realize till many years later, I used to get my bed made up as a freshman in McCulloch Hall and Elder Hall and the other dorms, which were all dedicated to freshmen back in those days. There was a woman who would make you bed 5 days a week, not in the girls' dorms. That's what irritated the heck out of my wife to be. She was in Allison Hall. No one made up her bed. And if she, well, maybe she did once in a while. But if she didn't do it, no one else did it. In our place, I didn't think anything of it. In fact, some of the folks who were the maids who cleaned the rooms and helped make the beds were also some of the best alarm clocks in the world, because guys who didn't want to get out of bed, you know, were knocked around a little bit by the woman who said, "Get up! It's time to go to your class." Some of them wouldn't have made it otherwise. Some of them just rolled over and went right back to sleep. I wanted to talk a little bit about communication with parents in that period of time. You know, the term helicopter parents, which apply to maybe to me as a parent. I hope not. Maybe it does, but maybe to some of your parents. That expression didn't exist back then. There was no need. There was no need to describe your mom or dad as a helicopter parent. It hadn't been invented yet. It's amazing how things have changed. But back then, parents didn't even accompany you to campus when you started school here. When I if you couldn't tell, I'm from New York originally. Hopped on a plane at LaGuardia to come here with all of my earthly belongings. Took a bus from the airport to the Orrington Hotel and schlepped from the Orrington Hotel up to McCulloch, carrying all my stuff. My father didn't get out here until I graduated. My mother came out, I think, my junior year. She got lost somehow, and then no, she came out here. But a lot of parents didn't come. I mean, you know, they got you on a bus, or maybe they dropped you off, and then you were on your own. But they didn't uniformly take you out here. To talk with your parents on the phone, you had to wait online, often in your dorms, for the pay phone down at the end of the hall. Think how encouraged you were to really do that. You didn't have phones in your rooms in the early on. Later on, that changed, and you really had to wait online to do that. Letters were actually written, although they mostly went from the parents to the kids. The students had very little time to write letters, and that probably hasn't changed, although the form has changed. Parents didn't even really know, in most instances, what classes you were taking. They never thought of talking to your advisor directly, or calling your professor to get you into a class, or to complain about a grade, or to complain with the vice president for student affairs about some infraction that you were talking to the vice president of student affairs about. You took care of that. They may not have even known about it. You took care of that. Today, it's very common, or more common than maybe we like to acknowledge, that parents will step in these kinds of situations. And I'll just tell you one real quick story about what it's like today for me as an administrator. I got an email transmitted to me last year from the president, who 10 minutes earlier had gotten an email from a parent, who 5 minutes earlier than that had gotten a call from this parent's daughter, on campus who had missed a bus, one of our buses that run around, one of our shuttle buses. And she was very upset. And I know this because I saw the email that she wrote to her parent because it got passed all the way through because the bus either left too early or, or she claims, and therefore she was stranded and really was in a panic. So what did she do? Didn't make alternate arrangements, didn't walk to wherever she was going, didn't do something, but emails her mom, who immediately emails Henry Beenan, who forwards the email to me. Now, I'm looking at my watch, and I'm looking at when these emails were sent, and I said, man, we got to do better than this. I mean, there's something wrong here with what's going on. So what did I do? I forwarded it on to Bill Bannis, our Vice President for Student Affairs, who wrote a letter to the mother that was a piece of art. I mean, it was a piece of work, because it basically said nicely, back off. Let your child grow. I mean, this is not something you really ought to be involved in. So I'm not saying this is representative of anybody in the room, although if the person who wrote that email is in the room, you do not have to raise your hand. It's okay. But it is much more representative today. I hear these stories all the time from faculty members and from staff, and I experience it somewhat myself. It is much more than it was back then. We just didn't engage, our parents just didn't engage in those kinds of things. Okay, getting a little bit more serious here, maybe a lot more serious. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the police and safety and security. I mentioned earlier that the university's police, both in Chicago and on the Chicago campus and the Evanston campus, report to me. And there are always issues day to day with the police, as you would expect. There are issues of thefts on campus and bike accidents and car accidents involving our faculty or our staff and students in the area around or on our campus. Sometimes we even have robberies, as you know, on campus or off campus, usually unarmed robberies, but yet serious kinds of things. And once in a while, we have more than that. We have an armed robbery. Thank goodness, not that often, but we've had them. We've had dorm intrusions on campus in our dormitories, as many of you know. And those are sort of more routine. They create their own levels of stress for the police and for me and others who have responsibility for the well-being of our students and faculty and staff, but they sort of come with the turf and you get used to dealing with them. And then you have special examples of things that threaten or potentially threaten the well-being of our student body and faculty and staff that really raise the blood pressure level and the stress level. And one of them, for example, in my tenure here was the visit to campus of Matt Hale. Matt Hale is now in federal prison for having been convicted of threatening a federal judge in a crime that he was tried for. But at the time he was out of jail, and Matt Hale was and probably still is a neo-Nazi whose group that he was associated with had a member who just a year or two prior shot and killed 3 people in the Chicago area, including our former basketball coach, Ricky Birdsong. Some of you may remember this. And then 2 others. I think it was an Asian American and a Hasidic Jew, I think. He sort of made the rounds with different ethnic nationality groups and killed each one of the 3. And Matt Hale was not involved in that directly. Was a representative of his group that did it. And Hale had said a lot of things and was clearly known for being a neo-Nazi. And he decided, I think because to seek publicity more than anything else, that he was going to come visit Northwestern to recruit students who he claimed had asked him to come to recruit students to his organization. And there were many students on campus, as well as faculty, who were very upset with this. And he promised he was going to come at 12 o'clock to meet his students and so forth, and he was going to come to tech. And anyway, to make a long story a little bit shorter, there were all kinds of groups there, some of them on the opposite extreme from Matt Hale, and our students wanted to protest this very vehemently. And we urged our students, and most of the students agreed to protest it in another location, which turned out to be very smart for us, because as soon as he showed up, it was like dropping a match into dry hay. All these people got into a fight all over the place. It was really ugly, really, really ugly. The riot police showed up in Evanston. Students were not hurt. The folks who were hurt, I think one might say, one cared a little bit less about. I don't want to be too much more explicit than that, but the ones we were most concerned about, frankly, were our faculty, staff, and students. And we survived it, and Hale went off to jail and later went off to prison for reasons having nothing to do with that visit. But we have those kinds of situations. We also have situations, of course, where our own students you all, for various reasons, decide that you want to camp out on the Rebecca Crown Plaza or on the plaza at the library for various causes, and that's fine. My concerns there really go to the safety of those students, because not everybody always agrees with what those students are protesting about, and you have to worry about the protection of those students when they're there overnight against those who may not agree with their point of view. But again, these are special kinds of circumstances which are challenging for us to be concerned about. And we do spend a lot of time planning for them and worrying about them and hopefully doing something to mitigate the risks. None of these things that I have been involved with, either here or at Johns Hopkins, when shanties were being built by those who were protesting apartheid in South Africa at the time, where shanties were being built and students were camped out in the shanties, and those who didn't agree with what they were saying actually burned down a couple of tents, thank goodness, with no students in them. This was student on student, this stuff. None of those things, even the shanty experience at Johns Hopkins, really got anywhere close to the kinds of student involvement, the kinds of dangers, the kinds of issues that occurred from 1967 to 71 when I was an undergraduate here. And that's what I want to spend a little time talking about, to give you some sense of the comparison of now to what went on in those 4 years. But first, I want to describe a little bit about what the context was for this activism that existed during that period of time. First, the events that I'll describe to you a little bit more in these 4 years generally fell into two separate but somewhat related categories. There were events and activities on campuses all across the country and at Northwestern that were what you might call civil rights or equal rights oriented. And then there were those events that had their origin or derivation from anti-war and what you might call counter-cultural sentiments. Second contextual comment I wanted to make to you is that Northwestern was hardly alone as a place where a lot of this took place, hardly alone. Student demonstrations, damage to campus buildings, and so forth were taking place all over the country. There were over 130 colleges and universities during this period of time, from East Coast to the West Coast, that were taking place. Many a heck of a lot more violent and a lot more destructive than what was going on at Northwestern. Places like Columbia, Harvard, Madison, Berkeley, and many others were much more volatile and had sort of a much higher level of student activism and faculty activism and discontent expressed in many ways than Northwestern. We were part of a context that was going on all over the place. And then I wanted to tell you about some of the national and international events that were going on around this time, because they help explain sort of the emotion and that went on among those who protested and did different things on our campus and elsewhere. These events greatly influenced and really caused the waves of campus activism from 67 to 71. First, on June 2nd, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. That was followed by race riots in tens and tens of cities, including Chicago, throughout the country that lasted for days. Tremendous amounts of burning of buildings, destruction, violence, person on person. This is when Mayor Daley, the current mayor's dad, issued his shoot-to-kill orders, which fortunately the police chief never exercised, but it was in response to the burning of large areas. These were mostly African-American protesters destroying what were predominantly African-American communities in the post-Martin Luther King assassination period. Soon thereafter, Robert Kennedy was a senator from New York then who had announced he wanted to run for governor, was killed in Los Angeles. That was in June, so this in 68. It's a pretty tight time frame here. And then right after that was the Democratic National Committee, the convention in Chicago, where students protesting the war in Vietnam and other injustices were handled very aggressively by the Chicago police and broadcasted nationally to homes throughout the country. Individuals who were watching the Democratic National Committee, a national convention on television. The next one is very important. A lottery was introduced for males, which was a way for how the draft into the military was going to be accomplished. That happened in this period of time also, right in the middle of the Vietnam War period of time. Folks who thought they were going to get all kinds of exemptions were realized through this lottery system that depending upon what your lottery number was, you may not get an exemption, and you could figure you were going to get drafted and end up in Vietnam. In my fraternity, we all chipped in $5 to give to the person who had the lowest lottery number, meaning that he was most likely to get drafted. It was really kind of an incredible time. And then, very importantly, particularly for what I'm going to talk about Kent State, and it's what happened on Northwestern's campus. Very importantly, President Nixon announced on May 4th, 1970, that he was going to expand the Vietnam War by sending American troops into Cambodia, which is what immediately sparked, again, a huge wave of campus protests. Remember now, the lottery was in place. The Vietnam War was extremely unpopular. The protesters in Chicago had been handled very aggressively by the Chicago police. There was all of these things going on, and at one of these demonstrations on the Kent State campus in Ohio, the National Guard was called in and killed 4 students who were protesting. That was an amazing thing, and sparked at Northwestern all kinds of demonstrations, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Or actually, I'll talk about it now. I'm up to it. On May 3rd and May 4th, immediately right following the Kent State killings, there was a major effort on the part of the students to protest. And this may be hard for you to believe, but there were thousands and thousands of students who protested in rallies all over campus, on Deering Meadow and so forth. The faculty and the administration decided to close the campus for 3 days, and then subsequent to that also decided that they would shut down classes for periods of time thereafter, and students were given the option between then and the time they would have ordinarily finished the academic year to take what is known as a T in your class, which meant you got credit for the class, but you didn't have to go to class anymore. But you got credit for passing. Sheridan Road, which was closed by the students. Barricades were set up for a number of days. The iron fence that used to enclose the campus by the arch was taken down. It was closed to all traffic. The traffic was diverted onto Orrington and Sherman. The National Guard, a lot of people don't know this, but the National Guard was called out, but through some very good decision-making on the part of university officials, never actually came on campus. They hung out at James Park, just a little bit west of downtown. Thousands, I think, or at least hundreds of them. I think there were thousands, if I remember my history correctly. And never actually came on campus, but they were ready. As I mentioned, thousands of protesters at the speeches. There were memorial services held where symbolically the 4 students were buried and honored on the grass at Deering Meadow. There was leafleting by hundreds, if not thousands, of students on Sheridan Road in Orrington, knocking on doors, leafleting, giving cars, giving information to cars as they passed by. There was a sports editor of the Daily Northwestern, me, who during that period of time made himself extremely unpopular with the athletic director by suggesting that spring football practice be shut down during that time when the campus was closed. They did not close down the spring football practice, and all I did was make an enemy of myself with the athletic director at the time, but I was right. And I still say that I was right. There were also, from what I've read and what I've heard, there was enormous amount of tension during this period of time. In other words, there were the students and a lot of the faculty who were demonstrating in various ways and having teach-ins and other kinds of things. But there were many individuals around, some alums, some in the community who were very much on the other side. So if you talk, as I have done, to officials and trustees that were on the scene at the time and some faculty members, you will get stories about phone threats, about body threats. There was an official at the university at the time who had his children go and come from school with security officers with that child, had to put in a separate phone in his house because the regular phone was taken up by obnoxious, nasty calls that were being made. So the context of it was that there was a lot of tension and a lot of strong belief on both sides. And there also was an interesting context. I had this story told to me about the FBI visiting the administrators at the time at Northwestern and showing then some pictures of a couple of student activists who were among the most vociferous or maybe the loudest. The pictures of these students allegedly being trained in terrorism, or at least activism, in Cuba the prior summer. When I heard this story, I have to tell you, I kind of chuckled a little bit, and it really wasn't appropriate, but I had this poor image of Secretary Powell speaking before the United Nations about, what, 4 or 5 years ago, with all these pictures about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and what we all know what turned out to be about those weapons of mass destruction. So I had this image of, conjured up that image, when in fact here what you had were FBI agents showing some of our administrators pictures of some of our students getting trained in Cuba. But you know, who knew whether it was true or not? And that's the point. You didn't know whether it was true or not. You had to take it all very, very seriously. There also were some that were going back a few more years. In 1968, there was starting off that period of time, in the spring of 1968, another incident that I think kind of typifies the tension of the time, and this really more relates to less anti-war and more civil rights and human rights and racial rights and so forth. And that was that a bunch of our students, primarily African-American students, took over the bursar's office and occupied it for 2 days. And it was a time when these particular students demanded and ultimately got from the university a lot more in terms of services and agreements and commitments to participate in recruiting more African-American students and more financial aid and more advising and so forth. In fact, the university acted, by my standards and my belief, incredibly responsibly in not going in and dispersing the students in a way that might have resulted in harm to the students, and also in the way that they responded positively to the students, doing things for the students in response that were reasonable and consistent with what the role of students was and what the role of administration was, but yet doing very meaningful things, but not crossing the line. But again, I have to tell you that the environment that existed during that period of time was extraordinary, and was, when I described to you earlier how it was in the Vietnam War period of time and the Kent State protests, how there were a lot of people who were very much opposed to what the university was doing and wanted the Sheridan Road to be cleared and wanted the students to be thrown into jail and so forth. There were a lot of people during this particular period of time who were very upset with the university for how it handled the situation with the African-American students. I want to quote to you just a paragraph from a history of Northwestern called Northwestern University A History, 1850 to 1975, written by Harold Williamson and Payson Wild. And it picks up as follows. The relief which followed the peaceful settlement of the dispute was rudely shattered by the banner headline on the front page of the Sunday morning edition of the Chicago Tribune of May 5th, 1968. It read, "Black Power wins at NU," end quote. The article characterized the agreement as a capitulation by the university. A scathing editorial the following day entitled, "A Sad Day for Northwestern," accused the university of having disregarded its statutory obligations and of having yielded its decision-making power to trespassing rascals. The fact that these newspaper accounts were inaccurate and misleading and in no way saved the administration from an avalanche of letters, in no way saved the administration from an avalanche of letters and calls, many of them vituperative, The president and his colleagues were castigated for abdicating their responsibility as administrators and for spinelessly allowing a small group of black students to dictate to the university. That the university had not, in fact, surrendered its fundamental authority was often overlooked in the barrage of criticism. Now, fortunately, most of the faculty of the university, and by vote, the trustees as well, stood by the administration, but not without a lot of this going on, in the community. Also during that period of time, so I mentioned the Kent State business, I mentioned the taking over of the bursar's office in May of 1969. There were multiple demonstrations on campus demanding that the university disclose entirely its investment portfolio, that it banned Dow Chemical, a producer of napalm, from recruiting students on campus. There was all those kinds of things that were going on. There's a few more here that I wanted to cite for you. Find my page. There was a great deal of demonstration on this campus, and this goes under the category of the anti-war policy, of a great deal of demonstration directed at ROTC and wanting ROTC to recruit off campus and not give scholarships to students on campus. And in April 27th, 1970, in what was probably the only event that really did damage, there was substantial damage done from arson at 621 Foster, which then was the home of the linguistics program. So it was an incredible time with a lot of emotion and a lot of activism on the part of folks. And I think the conclusion that I'd like to reach for you, or like to share with you, is as follows. I mean, you might say that my position at the university today, and as a student here in the late 60s and early 70s, gives me a pretty unique vantage point on the events of those 4 years. I can tell you that as a student, I had no clue about what was going on in management and what the trustees were up against and what the reaction was of the community. I was in my own little world, both as a freshman, as a sophomore, during the Kent State period of time. I was in my own little world. I certainly had no empathy for what management and the administration was going through, but I sure as heck can understand it now. And whether it was by luck, and I don't think it was, or whether it was by the patience of faculty leadership and the administration and the trustees, or some combination of all the above, Northwestern got through what could have been an absolutely disastrous period of time a hell of a lot better than places like Columbia did. There was nobody hurt during these periods of time. People had a chance to demonstrate what they wanted to demonstrate about. There was minor damage done, except in that arson situation, which probably wasn't related to demonstrations. There was minor damage done to the buildings, and the people from that period of time, probably a lot more than they thought after it and during the period of time, deserve a lot of congratulations and a lot of kudos from those of us who followed them as administrators and as students. And just one more quote from this, and then I'll wrap this up. Again, from the same history book of Northwestern. This is talking primarily about the incident of the African-American students taking over the bursar's office, but it pertains to all of the incidents during that period of time, that incident in Kent State and others. Thus, the crisis ended peacefully with no injury to life, limb, or property, and with considerable support within the university for the actions taken. The peaceful resolution of the crisis set a precedent which was to stand the university in good stead during the next few years, and I would argue in the decades beyond. Thank you. It's been fun.